So, Eric, at the local high school here in town, we had one of those incidents where a faculty member was having a tryst with a student. You know those stories. They happen all the time.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny because when I was a kid, you were lucky if the teacher let you bang the erasers.
Amen.
It's the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Welcome to the 81st installment of the ongoing series we call the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm here with my co-host Tom, and Paperback Warrior is the internet's top spot for reviews and discussions of 20th century vintage paperback fiction. You know, all those old paperbacks with the lurid painted covers that they just don't make anymore. Mm-hmm. That's what we talk about here. We host daily book reviews at paperbackwarrior.com, and this weekly show on Mondays. So let me throw it over to Tom to tell us what's in store for this week.
All right, thanks, Eric. Our feature today is about a company called Book Creations, Inc., and the owner, Lyle Kenyon Ingle, who is responsible for some of the most iconic titles in genre paperback fiction. I'm also going to be reviewing a book called The Plastic Nightmare by Richard Neely. What are you reviewing today, Eric?
So today I'm going to be reviewing a 1965 novel with a title that most of you listeners may recognize, In the Heat of the Night.
Oh.
So I'll get into the author and all the media tie-ins to this particular book.
Okay, cool. Before that, I got some odds and ends to touch upon. But before that, we should probably do the superfan shout-outs. Eric, why don't you give the listener a little context about what this is all about?
Absolutely. So both the Paperback Warrior blog and the podcast are completely free to our fans. We don't sell ads, nor do we put any of our content behind one of those pesky paywalls. We don't want anything to get in the way of you and the content we provide to you.
The problem with that approach, though, is that while Paperback Warrior is free for you, the listener, it ain't free for us. Recording equipment, SD cards, web hosting, audio software licenses, all those things cost money. Now, Eric and I are happy to fund this podcast out of our own pockets to a point. We both have wives and mortgages and mouths to feed, and you guys get it.
So the solution we came up with is the same solution that folk singers use on a subway platform. We play for tips.
Exactly. So if you go to paperbackwarrior.com and you click onto the desktop version, not the mobile version, and you go to the upper right-hand corner of the page, you're going to see a PayPal link there that allows you to donate to the show and keep the lights on here to ensure that we don't have to start selling you mattresses or herbal Viagra on the show.
Any amount you can give is appreciated, and if times are tough and you can't afford to donate, we completely get it. Just keep on listening for free and know that you're appreciated.
Yeah, every month or so, we like to recognize the superfans who donate to keep us solvent. We call this our Superfan Shoutout segment. And Eric, why don't you do the honors?
This month, we want to recognize the following superfans: David Kowalski, Catherine O'Neill, Daniel Conroy, Dustin Williams, Christopher Butler, Robert Dice, Peter Robel, William Franklin, Ron Peer, and I got one more here. Actually, I got two more. Let me grab the other one here. Jake Thomas.
That's the one that came in today?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And we also had Mike, what's his last name?
Mike Bray.
Mike Bray.
Yeah, of Wolfpack Publishing.
Oh, okay.
Gave us a nice donation as well. You guys should check out wolfpackpublishing.com. They're fantastic. So thank you so much, superfans. You are the fuel that keeps this train on the tracks. Speaking of superfans, a name that you hear almost every month is this guy, David Kowalski. He's a huge supporter of the show, and every listener owes him a debt of gratitude if you like the show. In addition to sending us donations, he also sent you and I gifts, and I'm actually handing this to you.
Wow.
I know you have a bad back because you've never exercised a day in your life, so be careful lifting this. It's actually wrapped. He wrapped the gift. It's kind of heavy, so why don't you unwrap it and tell the fans what David Kowalski sent in addition to the giant sack of money that he sends us darn near every month.
Yeah, this is an interesting a gift wrap here. It's like a canvas bag.
That's how Amazon does it.
Oh, okay. Wow, this thing is huge.
Yeah.
It's a book called The Company of the Dead by David Kowalski.
Yeah.
He's the author.
So David reached out for me after I said that I like time travel adventures. And the premise of this book that he wrote is it's really cool. So it's 1912, and a mysterious man boards the Titanic, and he actually saves the ship from sinking. And so we all know what happens in time travel novels when you stop some event in the past. You get this butterfly effect, and it triggers the series of events that makes the U.S. actually never entering World War I. Then we jump forward to 2012, and the U.S. is unrecognizable. The country is occupied by Germany on the East Coast and Japan on the West Coast. And there's one man alive who's a descendant of the Kennedy family who can restore the U.S. to its proper order. This book looks fantastic. Again, it's called The Company of the Dead by David J. Kowalski, and it's actually published by Titan Books. It was back in 2012. It looks terrific, and I just want to thank David Kowalski for sharing us. He sent both of us copies of this, and I'm going to check that out at some point.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. I always like these alternate history books.
Yeah, it's kind of neat. It's clearly he put a lot of work into it. He was nervous that we're not going to like it because it's real thick, but I have a good attention span. And moving on, I want to read you, Eric, a plot synopsis without telling you the title and author, and I want to get your thoughts. Ready to play along?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm
Okay.
good with that.
Billy is a killer for hire and the best in the business. But he'll do the job only if the target is a truly bad guy. And now Billy wants out. But first, there's one last hit. Billy is one of the best snipers in the world, a decorated war vet, and a Houdini when it comes to vanishing after the job is done. Eric, this book that I'm talking about, it's about love, luck, fate, and a complex hero with one last shot at redemption. Tell me, based on what you just heard, as far as the plot synopsis, who does this sound like?
You sounded like the martial arts teacher in Napoleon Dynamite.
That wasn't where I was going with that, but okay.
You sound just like him. So what you're telling me sounds like it's written by Donald Hamilton because, I mean, he was an expert on rifles and scopes and that kind of stuff. And he wrote a really good book called In the Line of Fire about a sniper.
Yeah, it was a good book.
But also you have Max Allan Collins' Corey character, who's a hitman, regarded as the best in the business, but this doesn't really sound like him, nor is his name Billy. There's also an author named Stephen Hunter. He wrote a series of books about a sniper. What's that guy? Bob Lee Swagger. Mm-hmm. And one of his books was Point of Impact, that was made into the movie Shooter, starring Mark Wahlberg. But then the idea of a hitman looking to quit the business who gets pressed into service for one last assassination is an idea that's done 1,000 times. Mm-hmm. But it was in the book The Last Contract by Clark Howard. I guess what I'm saying is that although the plot sounds great and it's probably in your wheelhouse, it's like I said, it's been done a million times. So.
Very good analysis, Eric. However, the book in question actually isn't out yet. It's scheduled for publication in August 2021, and the book is called Billy Summers by that young upstart author we talked about last week, Stephen King.
That's interesting. I had heard that he had a new book coming out. I didn't realize it was called Billy Summers. Didn't he have another book called Billy? It was a baseball book?
Yeah, something like
Billy.
that. Yeah,
okay.
I think you're right.
All right, now to be clear, though, this isn't the new hard case crime novel.
No, that was later. We reviewed that last
okay.
week, right? And that came out last week on the Hard Case Crime imprint, and I reviewed it on last week's show. Later is about a kid who sees dead people who ends up helping the NYPD. It's got some supernatural stuff in it and a good-sized horror element, which is more on brand with Stephen King. Because Later is a hard case crime book. Its list price is $15, and it clocks in at 266 pages. Now, the book about the sniper hitman, Billy Summers, is a hardcover from Scribner selling at the bargain basement low price of $30 and clocks in at a lean, mean 528 pages.
Oof.
Yeah. Now, see, while the plot of Billy Summers looks like it's totally right up our alley, the page count seems a little too high for that kind of book.
Yeah, I agree. And I was able to rattle off several books with essentially the same plot right off the top of my head. And each of these novels did the same thing in roughly 180 pages. So it sounds like there's a real risk of the Stephen King Billy Summers book being, overwritten. That
may be right. But then again, no one is going to pay $30 for a 180-page book. I mean, Stephen King's got to eat, Eric. Show some mercy.
Right. And that book we were talking about was Billy Blockade, or Blockade Billy. Remember that?
Yeah,
okay,
it was a baseball book.
Okay. As an aside, though, Stephen King has repeatedly expressed his admiration for vintage paperbacks of the mid-20th century. He grew up reading these, and it occurs to me that he would really, really like this show.
I completely agree. And if any of our fans know Stephen King personally, please just tell him about the show. I know he's actually pretty much relocated to Florida. He's actually down in Sarasota for much of the year. We don't do guests on our show, but I think, what do you think? You think we can make an exception for Stephen King if he was to come on the show and hang out here with us?
I think we can definitely make some room at this poker table where we record this show for the quintessential king of horror.
Maybe one day we'll be able to read his name on a Superfan shout-out.
Dude, I would treasure that PayPal receipt like forever. I'd print it out and frame it.
There you go. So let's do this feature. Play some music. To introduce today's feature, I want to show you this series of books and get your impression. Let me get these. I promise this is actually going somewhere informative. Let me hand you this stack of books. Tell the listener what I gave you and give me your first impressions.
Oh, these look neat. So they're called Faraday, number 1, Faraday or Faraday number 3, 4, and number 5. The author's name on here is William Grant, which I'm assuming is a pseudonym, and from looking at if I were shopping and saw these, I would think that they were adult westerns.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm off.
Okay, so the Faraday series lasted 6 books in 1988 and 1989 from a New York publisher called Lynx Books. The series was marketed as westerns, but it's really about this guy named Matthew Faraday who runs an agency called Faraday Security Service in the late 1800s that solves crimes. Most of his clients are railroads. He's got this ensemble cast of agents working for Faraday's firm who get dispatched to go undercover to solve mysteries. The first installment is called The Iron Horse, and in this one, it's Kansas Pacific Railroad that's in trouble. They're laying track through the West, but the project keeps getting interrupted through sabotage and murder. So Faraday dispatches some of his best undercover agents, including Dan Britton, to get to the bottom of the situation. So each of the books is basically an Old West mystery taking place on a train or dealing with the train industry.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And what's the author? What's the deal with the author here? William Grant.
Okay, so you have a good eye because you guessed that there's no actual William Grant in the author of the Faraday series. It was what we call a house name. Now, a house name is different than a pseudonym. When Marvin Albert wrote books under the name of Albert Conroy, that's a pseudonym. There was no one else using the Albert Conroy name. And depending on the contract he signed with his publishers, he retained the rights to the work he did under the Albert Conroy name. Now, a house name is something a little different. The author's name is owned by the publisher who hires an author to write the book under that house name. The writer gets paid with a flat fee or royalties based on sales, but the author does not maintain the intellectual property rights to the work unless he reaches some sort of deal on the front end.
Makes sense.
A good example of this would be the Long Arm adult western series by Tabor Evans. Now, of course, there's no such person as Tabor Evans. Berkeley Books just hired people to write Long Arm books, and they gave them about $2,000 a book. As long as they didn't kill off the hero and the book sold reasonably well, they'd probably be invited back to write another installment. There are dozens of people out there who were Tabor Evans in that 400-book run of the series. So let's get back to Faraday. There was no William Grant. It was a house name. And according to friend of the show, Steve Mayall, whose website is Western Fiction Reviews, the rundown is this. James Reasoner wrote the very first one, The Iron Horse.
Oh, interesting.
Paul Block wrote the second. An author named Robert Vaughn wrote books 3, 5, and 6. And the late, great Bill Kreider wrote the fourth book. Now, Western Fiction Reviews says that Lynx Books, the publisher, went out of business before they could publish the last 2 books in the series. And so the 2 unpublished books were book number 7, Avalanche Run by Bill Kreider, and number 8 was the Owl Hoot Express, written by Chet Cunningham, but they never saw the light of day. So grab one of these Faraday books for me, just for this experiment here, because I promise this is going somewhere, and take a look at the copyright page and tell me what it says.
It says that the book is copywritten by Book Creations, Inc., and that it was produced by Book Creations, Inc., whose founder is Lyle Kenyon Engel.
Now, to be clear, this book is not copyright James Reasoner, the author, correct?
It is not.
And it's also not copyright Lynx Books, the publisher, right?
That is correct. It's copyright to the producer of the books, whatever that means.
All right, so I'm leading the witness here.
Okay.
So Book Creations, Inc. is a company that you're often going to see on the copyright pages of paperbacks in the 1970s and 1980s. And oftentimes it was accompanied by this name, Lyle Kenyon Ingle. Now, Engel, let's talk about him a little bit. He was not a fiction author. He's only credited with writing a handful of nonfiction books in the early 1970s, like The Complete Book of NASCAR Stock Racing and Bicycling for Fun and Health.
Okay.
He achieved his success in the world of paperback fiction as a book producer. This means he would come up with a concept and hire a writer or author to write the novel. Usually it's a series. He then had editors in-house to edit the books. Sometimes his own son, George Ingle, who worked for Dad. And maybe, I don't even know, he sometimes would hire a cover artist. I'm not sure about that, to actually do this. Then he would have this book, which is sort of a finished product at that point, and he would sell that book to a publisher like Pinnacle or Award Books. And he and the author would, in theory, split the royalties. It was a very good deal for the paperback publishing houses because all they needed to do was run the printing presses and handle distribution. All the work and the production of this book was done by Book Creations, this company based in Canaan, New York. In 1983, they actually relocated to Boca Raton, Florida. So some of the series titles created under this Book Creations, Lyle Kenyon Engel venture, and again, he didn't write them, but he created them and produced them. Let me go through some of the titles. There's the Richard Blade series by Jeffrey Lord. We talked about that. The Baroness series by Paul Kenyon, which is a sexy spy series. Nick Carter Killmaster was his, but he needed to license that character from Street and Smith because Nick Carter was a character back in the detective pulps. There's a series called John Eagle Expediter by Paul Edwards, which was actually written by 3 authors, Manning Lee Stokes, Robert Laurie, and Paul Iden. Stagecoach Station was a Book Creations series by Hank Mitchum, which many of those books I think were written by James Reasoner. You reviewed Chopper Cop by Paul Ross, which is actually written by Dan Stribe for the first 2 volumes, and a collaboration of Bill Amadon and Nat Friedland for the last one. Cody's Law by Matthew Hart was actually written by James Reasoner and Bill Kreider. He also had a series called Space Probe 6 by Charles Huntington. I don't know who wrote that. The Don Miles series by Larry Kenyon is about a stock car racer who's also a spy. The Hotline series of spy thrillers was written under the house name of Paul Richards. So, and on and on and on. So even though Kenyon Engel produced a lot of series titles that are right up our alley, his real bread and butter, Eric, were historical epic series titles, with the bestsellers being the Kent Family Chronicles that made John Jakes famous. Now, many of you may have seen those around because Volume 1 was called The Bastard. And Ingle was paying Jake royalty checks of $400,000 every 6 months on that series. Now, bear in mind that Ingle is also splitting these royalties 50-50 with the author. So every dime that he paid John Jakes was a dime that he was putting in his own pocket for a book he didn't even write. Now, I'm not putting the guy down for this. I'm just saying it's a pretty cool business model. One staple you're always going to see in book creation books was plots or subplots revolving around dogs and children. Ingle felt that the secret to a bestseller was the inclusion of dogs and children as major characters in his books. No, that was his thing. He's got the key, right? He used to put classified ads in Writer's Digest looking for writers. And at his peak, he had 40 writers in his stable to whom he'd farm out installments in all these series titles he was producing. So Ingle died of leukemia in 1986 at age 71 with over 100 million copies of books that he produced in print. The Kent Family Chronicles alone was 35 million copies. The Wagons West books were 23 million copies. Now, his widow Marla and his son George kept the company alive for a few more years, continuing to produce books. In the early 1990s, they were producing as many as 30 original Westerns per year. It was really a thriving business, and they had a lot of very good writers in their stable. Some of Book Creation's most successful titles were frontier epics under the house name of Dana Fuller Ross, like this 24-volume Wagons West series. Now, you know a thing or two about that series, right, Eric? Why don't you fill us in on that?
So the Wagons West series started in 1978, and the books were originally set in the early 1800s. And like you said, they were written under the house name of Dana Fuller Ross. The actual author of this series was Noel B. Gerson, and he lived from 1914 to 1988. The series is about a fictional Holt family. They're American frontiersmen, and the family's led westward by the patriarch. His name is Michael Whip Holt. He goes by Whip as his name. He's a wagon master facing danger and seduction in each of these installments. The series was a monster hit. It sold a lot of books, as you alluded to earlier. Engel was a smart businessman, and he didn't want to give up a good thing. So in 1989, he launched a spin-off series under the title The Holts, an American Dynasty, under that same house name, Dana Fuller Ross. The series focused on Whip Holt's sons in the late 1800s and went for, it looks like 10 installments. I can only imagine that series probably did really well, too. Tom, you and I are both big fans of James Reasoner's writing.
Yeah, I discovered James Reasoner when I was reading a lot of long-arm books, and he was definitely my favorite author of that series. And so then I started seeking out his mystery novels and westerns under his own name, and I got to know him personally through a Facebook group I co-moderate called the Men's Adventure Paperbacks of the 20th Century, and he's just a really great guy. He's just super accessible and happy to answer all my dumb questions about who wrote this book or who wrote that book. And I just really admire him as a person and an author.
Yeah, he's really approachable. After the 10 books, so after his 10 books as Dana Fuller Ross, and they did really well, Book Creations asked him to do a prequel series called Wagons West that follows the Holt family before the original series. So there were 3 books in this series called Westward, Expedition, and Outpost. So even though these 3 books were written last in the early 1990s, they actually take place before the 24-book series that was written by Noel Gerson under that Dana Fuller Ross name, the series that hit the paperback shelves in 1978.
Now, Louis L'Amour also did something similar when he traced a family through generations in kind of a non-linear series, right? You like that series.
Yeah, that was his Sackett series, and there's some similarities there with the frontier and dangers and the wilderness kind of thing.
Now, you read and reviewed the chronologically first book in the Holt family series called Westward, with an exclamation point at the end. So you have to Westward!
Yeah.
Written by James Reasoner as Dana Fuller Ross. And the book was produced by Book Creations, Inc. Tell us about it. How was it?
I loved it. In Westward, brothers Jeff and Clay Holt are introduced to readers in the year of 1805. 477 pages, and there's a lot of storylines, and each of them is equally compelling and just action-packed. The first is Clay's acclimation back into civilization after his years in the wilderness. He was on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Second is the book's middle chapters that expand upon a deadly and violent feud between the Holts and this family of Garwoods. So it's kind of like the Hatfield and McCoy's feud.
Right.
And both of these families come to blows with one of the Garwoods proving to be a really dangerous threat to Clay and Jeff's parents and their siblings. The novel's third act places both of these brothers into the wild, untamed land of the West, and they're in the Rocky Mountains fighting rival trappers. And there's also some interaction with Native Americans, and the Garwood family shows up again way out there, and they have to do battle with them all over again. I think if you love the Louis L'Amour novels like, say, Jubal Sackett or To the Far Blue Mountains, you're really going to love this series. It also has a Zane Grey flavor, especially with his Spirit of the Border trilogy, which shares some of the same locations with Reasoner's Westward novel. Beautiful mountains, really an epic presentation of frontier action. If you like those types of westerns, then I think this is just a must-read. There was also a follow-up series. It's called Wagons West, the Empire Trilogy.
Now, you actually talked to Reasoner, reached out for him at least to ask about the genesis of the series and what his dealings were like with Lyle Kenyon Ingle. What did he tell you?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of asking James Reasoner about this novel and the series, and he explained that he isn't sure really who came up with the idea of these Wagons West prequels, whether it was him or his editor at Book Creations, Inc. He told me that his wife half-jokingly said, what they don't tell you is, when she's talking about history, she says, what they don't tell you is that it was Lewis and Clark and Holt. He said everything else just kind of sprang from that idea, and he believes Westward is not only the longest book he's written, but Tom, he says it was also his best-selling novel.
Wow.
And then he went on to add that he had created a third trilogy of books. These were in the planning stages, and they would have been titled Wagons West, the Rogue Trilogy. But for whatever reason, at the last minute, Bantam just changed their mind, and the books never came to fruition.
Interesting. So at the risk of making this the James Reasoner episode, he also wrote another series for Book Creations Inc. called The Patriots. under the name Adam Rutledge, and it's about the American Revolutionary War. Now, the series ran for 6 books in the early 1990s, and it's still available under Reasoner's own name as print and ebooks. The series follows a fictional character named Daniel Reed, who travels from Virginia to Boston to study law in 1773. As soon as he gets to Boston, he finds himself like hip deep in the unrest that led to the American Revolution. It's a really cool series because it has all these historical characters that we learn about in like school, and they're secondary characters in the series that really follows one guy through the sex, drama, and violence of the war. If you want to check that series out, the first volume is called The Sons of Liberty, and it's available from Rough Edges Press under the name of James Reasoner.
You know, ironically, I just talked to my dad over the weekend, and he had sit down last week and read all of those Patriot novels.
They're really good.
He says they're great.
Yeah, I mean, and as someone who had a terrible knowledge of the Revolutionary War, I actually learned a lot from reading them.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I guess everyone's just getting laid. Who knew?
Wow.
As the 21st century rolled around, Book Creations, Inc. just sort of ran out of steam. It still technically exists as a company under the control of George Engel, Lyle's son, but they rarely produce much of anything these days. In 2012, Book Creations did produce a new Dana Fuller Ross book called Texas Freedom about the Texas Revolution, but it was totally unconnected to the Wagons West series. My impression is that it didn't make much of a splash commercially, and the company's been pretty quiet since then. Some of Book Creation Inc.'s titles are being reprinted by the authors under their real names, but that's kind of touch and go. In any case, I just thought it was important for the listener to understand who Book Creations Inc. was and how they fit into the world of genre paperback fiction. At the very least, you at least know why you keep seeing that weird company name on your copyright pages. Oh yeah, one last thing. Remember that Faraday series of Western train detective stories that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation? Well, the first installment has been re-released by James Reasoner under his own name. You can get it off of Amazon under the name Faraday, the Iron Horse. Meanwhile, our friends at Wolfpack Publishing have reprinted the Robert Vaughn titles in the series. They're called The Gold Train, The Trackwalker, and Train of Glory. And they're about to print some entirely new books in the Faraday series, co-written by Reasoner and Vaughn together. The first one's called Buffalo Train, and it's going to be out later this year. If you go onto Amazon and basically search for Faraday Reasoner or Faraday Vaughn, you're going to find them all. Or you can just check out wolfpackpublishing.com or subscribe to their newspaper. That's a huge victory for readers who just want to keep these books alive because they look really cool. What are your thoughts?
Hey, I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Lyle Kenyon Ingle died in 1986.
Yes.
And that was before the Palm Pilot reading experience that early. What do you think he would have thought about digital publishing nowadays?
I have no idea, but one thing I do know is that he would have figured out a way to make a lot of money doing it.
Yeah.
He was a very good businessman.
Yeah,
and,
I think so too.
He sold a lot of books, and he seemed to have his finger on the pulse of what people wanted to read during that era. And so he was one of these guys who, my guess, it would have shifted quite nicely into digital publishing and would have hired people to write books. They probably would have been paid a lot less, though, because ebooks tend to command a lot less than paperback does.
It's a shame that he couldn't see the digital publishing boom.
Yeah,
he was
and I'm not even saying the guy's a hero. He might have been a heel. I don't know anything about him personally, but all I know is that that business model he created cranked out a lot of really good books.
Yeah.
So why don't we shift gears and give us a book review, Eric?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, listeners may be familiar with this book, or its title anyhow. It's called In the Heat of the Night, and it was authored by John Ball, and it was published back in 1965, and the book was adapted for cinema in 1967, earning 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. It was also made into a television series, and I think it lasted a few seasons. Came on in the late 1980s. In Hollywood lore, there's a quote from the book and the movie. It's a pretty simple line. Tom, you've probably even heard it. They call me Mr. Tibbs.
Yeah. It's a famous line.
Oh, yeah. But how this directly relates to Paperback Warrior is that In the Heat of the Night is an excellent vintage crime fiction novel. It's also the first novel to feature an African-American homicide detective named Virgil Tibbs. Now, Ball would later author 6 more novels starring Virgil Tibbs. Some of these books are also made into films. Essentially, In the Heat of the Night was John Ball's most memorable work, and after reading it, I can completely understand why. The book is set in the 1960s in a southern small town of Wells, South Carolina. And it's here where this young cop named Sam Wood patrols the streets on the graveyard shift. And right after his midnight lunch break, Wood discovers this dead body lying in the highway. So after notifying a police chief named Bill Gillespie, Wood's instructed to immediately prowl the area for strangers. That makes sense. In a dark train station, Wood finds an African-American man casually reading a paperback book. Sounds like we would get along fine with him.
Absolutely.
After discovering the African-American has a wallet filled with cash, Wood immediately hauls him in as the prime murder suspect. One of the best scenes of any novel that I've probably recently read occurs when Tibbs is brought into the police station as a suspect to be interviewed by Police Chief Bill Gillespie.
So they just grabbed him because he was like a black guy on the street.
Yeah, he's a black guy. No one's around. He's in the train station, which is abandoned at that hour of the night, and he's sitting there with a wallet full of cash. They think he stole it.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly funny, and it's such a memorable scene where Gillespie learns that this man is named Virgil Tibbs. He's a veteran homicide detective from Pasadena, California. And as the narrative tightens up, readers learn that Tibbs was trained in martial arts with a specialty in karate, judo, and aikido. And in addition, he's a veteran of the Pasadena police force, becoming a homicide detective after 5 years of patrol. And what's really interesting is Gillespie is basically telling Tibbs, you can't even eat with us. Like, we have separate bathrooms for you. Like, you're not even doing that. And Tibbs just responds, we do things different in California.
Indeed, they did.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's true.
Totally different. But Tibbs he's what they call an armchair polymath, which I know John Ball's favorite literature hero was Sherlock Holmes. So it kind of makes sense that there have some similarities. He's astute at problem solving with this almost supernatural attention to detail. But in the Deep South of the 1960s, Tibbs finds that he's in a totally different world. In this book, the author wisely chooses to not make Tibbs this indestructible, action-packed hero. And it would have made sense at the time because it was a campy spy era of that time, and Ball could have easily made Tibbs this martial arts crime-fighting hero. But he simply describes Virgil's talents and does put them to good use a few times. But Tibbs is the thinking man's detective, and thankfully, he isn't this extraordinary hero that just runs around shooting and karate chopping everyone. But here's what I wrote in my review as the wrap-up, and I'll be finished with this. It says in my review, as one can imagine, the author explores the line between racial hostility and small-town justice. After learning that Tibbs is a highly regarded detective, Gillespie asks for his assistance with the corpse. Through character interviews, Tibbs learns more about the case despite the town's opposition that a colored man is leading the investigation. Tibbs, knowing that Gillespie and Wood are both inexperienced, is extremely humble and complacently accepts his role as a victim of racism. This is where Ball absolutely shines as a storyteller. Tibbs doesn't particularly care about the injustice or the racial hostility or Gillespie's browbeating. He's far above all of that. He's never in the ditch, but he's up on the road. Tibbs is consumed by the murder mystery, and through the book's 150 pages, I don't recall Tibbs ever stopping for rest. Instead, he ascends to some plane of existence that only contains him, the murdered, and the murderer. Thankfully, Ball doesn't make readers rest in this headspace all the time. Instead, he presents the story by centralizing Wood and Gillespie, and readers rarely will ride with Tibbs, but instead are presented his findings, just like Wood and Gillespie are. But overall, I just loved this book. If you're a fan of the film, there's some key differences in the novel. The film has Tibbs being from Philadelphia. The murdered man is someone quite different, and the suspects all have different professions and roles. So there's a lot of differences there with the cast. Most notably is that the film version presents Tibbs as an angered individual when faced with racism. But the novel's the opposite, and in my experience, the book's better than the movie.
It always is.
Yeah, it really is. But I don't want to go too far into the Virgil Tibbs series because we're going to plan to do a feature on this series and the author, including his Talon trilogy, which I've read a little bit of that as well. But yeah, Tom, go for it.
Sweet. Okay, I'm going to review a book called The Plastic Nightmare. After a successful career as an advertising executive, Richard Neely, who lived from 1916 to 1999, he left behind the Mad Men life to become a full-time writer. He authored 15 novels in the 1960s and 1970s, including The Plastic Nightmare from 1969. Now, the book was the basis of the 1999 film called Shattered and has been re-released by Starkhouse Press as a double packaged with Neely's book While Love Lay Sleeping. So getting back to the plastic nightmare. Our narrator is this guy named Dan Marriott, and he awakens in a Santa Barbara, California hospital room with his head wrapped in gauze and all memories completely erased. Yes, Eric, this is an amnesia story.
Yep.
So he's got months of hospitalization and plastic surgeries that restore his face to something resembling his original self before the car accident decimated his body and his sense of personal history. None of what people tell him about himself seems the least bit familiar. Now, his wife, her name's Judith, and even his own reflection all seem foreign to him. So he's got no remembered experiences that give him any insight into his own character. He's this blank slate, but he's free now to follow his own instincts, and his gut is telling him that something is seriously wrong here. With the bandages off, Dan and his wife Judith leave the clinic to go to their beachfront cottage together and then eventually transition Dan back into society before returning home to San Francisco. Now, Dan's face and body heal at home with Judith, and it becomes very clear that she is hiding something about him and about the accident that took his memory. He begins to piece together that before the accident, maybe his marriage wasn't all that hot. As the evidence mounts, Dan begins to suspect that the car crash that he was in may not have been an accident at all. And then the question is, why would Judith attempt to murder him when a simple divorce would have sufficed? Now, as an avid reader of vintage paperbacks and the world's foremost expert on these type of books, which is what I am, I saw where this book was headed from a mile away. But actually, I have to say, it did not diminish my enjoyment of the book. Now, a mystery concerning the narrator's past, for me, always makes for fascinating reading. At times, actually, the plot reminded me of that brilliant Christopher Nolan movie, Memento. Did you ever see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Neely sprinkles in a bunch of rich and colorful characters, including a private detective who's kind of hired to get to the bottom of things. Man, I love this book, Plastic Nightmare. It was so clever and well thought out. It really makes me want to explore more of Neely's fiction. So fans out there, listeners, if you are fans of awesome suspense novels, you and I all owe a debt of gratitude to Starkhouse for resurrecting the Plastic Nightmare. This is essential reading. It's really my highest recommendation that I've given in ages. And so that's The Plastic Nightmare by Richard Neely. And Eric, I believe, looking at the clock, this wraps up today's episode. But before I forget, if you have not bought it yet, check out that Men's Adventure Quarterly. I don't think we did enough to actually hype it when we talked about it a few weeks ago. It's available from Amazon. It's the first issue. It's all Western stories reprinted from the Men's Adventure magazines in the 1950s and 1960s. And the color illustrations from the magazines are absolutely incredible. I'm told issue 2 is going to be on spy fiction, and I'm really psyched for that. And I think you and I may actually have a role in writing the introduction for it.
Oh, yes. Yeah, fun. And I went to Tennessee last week, and I took that book with me just because they're short stories.
Yeah.
I read it on the way. It's amazing. It's stacked with the stories, and I do plan on doing a review of it because I've read about half of it already.
Oh, good.
And
Thank you.
Bill Cunningham's art is all through it, and that guy's just amazing.
He's like my favorite graphic designer. Everything he touches just looks so good. Again, It's called Men's Adventure Quarterly. If you just type that into Amazon, you're going to get it. And so why don't you wrap us up, Eric?
All right, so that concludes episode 81 of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Join us next Monday for another new episode, and please join us every day at paperbackwarrior.com for all the new reviews of these vintage books. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, and Friendster. Okay, whatever that is. Review us on... why did you write that down for me to say that?
Friendster. That was like the very first social network.
Was it?
Yeah,
I don't remember that.
Remember we on MySpace back in the day?
Yeah.
It was before MySpace. It was Friendster.
Wow, that really
It's a
shows your
joke.
age.
Our people, our listeners are so old. They're going to remember Friendster. Trust me. That joke's going to kill. Just keep it in the show.
I'll keep it there. Review us on iTunes, please. Donate on PayPal. Stay hydrated. Eat enough fiber. Watch your carbs. Tom literally wrote this on a post-it for me to say. We'll see you next time, guys.
Be cool.